The psychological toll that weighed on Abraham Lincoln as he made his first inaugural address must have been nearly too much for any man to bear. He was a figure that had, through his election, almost ensured that the United States would soon be divided in civil war.
In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature.
As Lincoln was elected in the election of 1860, South Carolina formally announced its secession. By the following February, 6 more states followed, adopting a new constitution and declaring themselves the Confederate States of America. That same month, Allan Pinkerton, founder of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, was hired to ensure the president-elect's safe passage through Baltimore, Maryland, on his way to the inauguration. Allegedly, a conspiracy existed to kill Lincoln on a whistle-stop tour in Baltimore. The plan apparently was for several members of the crowd at President Street Station to be armed with knives, and when the president switched rail cars, someone would be close enough to kill him. Thanks to Pinkerton, Lincoln made it to Washington unscathed and took the oath of office on March 4, 1861. The following month, Lincoln faced what would become the signal that began the American Civil War. Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, was under siege by the newly formed Confederate Army, and the first general officer, Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard. South Carolina Governor Francis W. Pickens demanded that the U.S. Army leave the installation, but Major Robert Anderson refused and notified the governor that he was sending to President Lincoln for supply ships. When Lincoln authorized the aid to the besieged fort, the Confederates took this act as one of war on the Southern secessionists. If Confederates and conspirators watched Lincoln's every move, so too did his political enemies. Once the war was over, many in his own party favored harsh consequences for Confederates, while Democrats called for compromise. Every decision made by Lincoln was painstakingly scrutinized, as the abolishment of slavery, a central issue in the American Civil War, shaped Lincoln's policy and platform. The pressures faced by Lincoln during Reconstruction, even coming from those who would be his allies, took a heavy toll on him. Nonetheless, Lincoln managed to be re-elected in 1864, and when he delivered his second inaugural speech, he offered a glimpse into his thoughts on the war.
On the occasion corresponding to this, 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came.
By 1895, conflict in Cuba had arisen against Spanish colonial rulers, and the United States people naturally favored the rebels. President William McKinley echoed the outrage of the American citizens at the cruel reprisals by the Spanish against the people of Cuba, which included placing Cubans in internment camps near Spanish military bases. Initially, McKinley sought peaceful compromise and began negotiations with Spain in 1897. But when the USS Maine, en route to Cuba to protect American lives and property, was sunk by an underwater mine, and Spain continued to refuse any concessions to the Cuban people, McKinley, without asking for a formal declaration of war, turned the matter over to Congress to decide how best to proceed.
The existing conditions cannot but fill this government and the American people with the gravest apprehension. There is no desire on the part of our people to profit by the misfortunes of Spain. We have only the desire to see the Cubans prosperous and contented, enjoying that measure of self-control which is the inalienable right of man, protected in their right to reap the benefits of the exhaustless treasures of their country. The offer made by my predecessor in April 1896, tendering the friendly offices of this government, failed. Any mediation on our part was not accepted. In brief, the answer read, "There is no effectual way to pacify Cuba unless it begins with the actual submission of the rebels to the mother country. Then only could Spain act in the promised direction, of her own motion and after her own plans." The cruel policy of concentration was initiated February 16, 1896. The productive districts controlled by the Spanish armies were depopulated. The agricultural inhabitants were herded in and about the garrison towns, their lands laid waste and their dwellings destroyed. This policy the late Cabinet of Spain justified as a necessary measure of war and as a means of cutting off supplies from the insurgents. It has utterly failed as a war measure. It was not civilized warfare, it was extermination.
Advances in telephone and telegraph technologies at the time made McKinley's job as commander-in-chief a little easier, as day-to-day communication was even more instantaneous. While the technology advanced, it was still problematic to transmit commands to the Philippines, where U.S. naval forces, led by Commander George Dewey aboard the USS Olympia, fought Spanish squadrons in the Pacific Theater. When American forces overtook the Spanish in the Battle of Manila, the commanders there were unaware that a ceasefire had been signed between the U.S. and Spain on August 12, 1899. The following day, the United States captured Manila, an action deeply resented by the Filipino rebel forces also vying for the city. This later led to the Philippine-American War, as the United States and Filipino rebels then vied for control of the region.
The people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war. It is natural and inevitable that there should be the utmost variety of sympathy and desire among them with regard to the issues and circumstances of the conflict. Some will wish one nation, others another, to succeed in the momentous struggle. It will be easy to excite passion and difficult to allay it. Those responsible for exciting it will assume a heavy responsibility for no less a thing than that the people of the United States, whose love of their country and whose loyalty to its government should unite them as Americans, all bound in honor and affection to think first of her and her interests, may be divided in camps of hostile opinion, hot against each other, involved in the war itself in impulse and opinion, if not in action. I venture, therefore, my fellow countrymen, to speak a solemn word of warning to you against that deepest, most subtle, most essential breach of neutrality, which may spring out of partisanship, out of passionately taking sides.
President Woodrow Wilson spent the years of 1914 through 1917, during his first term in office, fighting tooth and nail to keep the United States out of the Great War in Europe, what would later come to be known as World War I. In his early stance, Wilson urged Congress and the citizens of the United States not to take sides in the war and refused to build a standing army for possible defense or entry into the war. These actions drew criticism from Republicans, led by former President Theodore Roosevelt, as it became clear that the Germans were ignoring Wilson's demand for an end to German submarine attacks on civilian ships. Even after a narrow re-election on the "He kept us out of the war" slogan, and the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, resulting in the loss of 128 American lives and a total loss of 1,195 lives, Wilson and the United States maintained neutrality. After Germany instituted a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, and the United States intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, a coded message that U.S. codebreakers revealed to be an attempt by the Germans to ally with the Mexicans against America, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany on April 2nd, 1917.
I am not now thinking of the loss of property involved, immense and serious as that is, but only of the wanton and wholesale destruction of the lives of non-combatants, men, women, and children, engaged in pursuits which have always, even in the darkest periods of modern history, been deemed innocent and legitimate. Property can be paid for. The lives of peaceful and innocent people cannot be. The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a warfare against mankind. It is a war against all nations. American ships have been sunk. American lives taken in ways which it has stirred us very deeply to learn of, but the ships and people of other neutral and friendly nations have been sunk and overwhelmed in the waters in the same way. There has been no discrimination. The challenge is to all mankind, with a profound sense of the solemn and even tragical character of the step I am taking. I advise that the Congress declare the recent course of the Imperial German government to be in fact nothing less than war against the government and people of the United States. That it formally accept the status of belligerent, which has thus been thrust upon it.
After the declaration passed on April 6, 1917, Wilson handed command of the military to General John J. Pershing, who became the only person to be promoted in his lifetime to the highest rank ever held in the U.S. Army, General of the Armies. Wilson gave Pershing complete control of the military actions during the war, including strategy and even diplomacy. Back home, having all but relinquished control of the military to Pershing, Wilson pushed laws through Congress designed to suppress anti-British, pro-German, or anti-war opinion. Under Wilson, the first Western Propaganda Office, the U.S. Committee on Public Information, was formed. Its aim, to spread patriotism and anti-German sentiment to the masses. The committee also conducted acts of censorship, as the new laws saw some people jailed for criticizing the government or Wilson, and any newspaper or periodical that spoke against U.S. policy was banned from the U.S. mail system. While Wilson implemented oppressive and, some argued, unconstitutional edicts on the home front, General Pershing and the Allies were able to end the fighting in Europe in just under a year. If America had to be pushed into World War I, 1941 and President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw America thrown headlong into World War II.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace.
Any anti-war sentiment that had existed in 1941 quickly vanished after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. 4 days after the strike, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States as well, and President Roosevelt found himself with his advisors commanding a war on several fronts. While the goal of crushing Nazi Germany from two sides in Europe and blocking their advances in the USSR and North Africa were there from the beginning, public opinion gave priority to the Pacific theater and the defeat of Japan. Roosevelt's strategy from the home front was to put the right people into the right role. He named Admiral Ernest J. King his chief of naval operations, who commanded both the Navy and Marine forces, while General George C. Marshall was given command of the Army and Air Force in name only. General Hap Arnold commanded the Air Force in practice. In addition to the new command structure, Roosevelt created the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a selection of advisors to the President and the Secretary of Defense, made up of senior officers from the Department of Defense, then called the Department of War, that became responsible for the final decisions regarding American military strategy. Unlike Wilson, who gave his commanders carte blanche, Roosevelt and his cabinet consulted with the Joint Chiefs, and the Americans met with their equivalents in Britain to form the Combined Chiefs of Staff. While the President worked closely with his Joint Chiefs, no civilians were allowed to weigh in on strategy meetings, including Secretaries of War or the Navy. To destroy the Axis powers, Roosevelt also cooperated and consulted with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to develop a strategy that would end the German and Japanese reign of terror. Though Roosevelt died before completing his final term, and before the war was over, the United States' entry into World War II had already proven beneficial to the American economy, which in 1941 was still in the midst of the Great Depression. Manufacturing, spurred by munitions and other war front requirements, had already begun to lift the country's spirit, in addition to the country's bank balance. Roosevelt's final running mate and vice president, Harry S. Truman, would face a daunting challenge and a heavy responsibility with the end of World War II.
16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It had more than 2,000 times the blast power of the British Grand Slam, which is the largest bomb ever used in the history of warfare. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor, and they have been repaid many-fold. And the end is not yet. We are prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war.
When FDR passed away and his vice president Harry S. Truman assumed office, it was only a matter of weeks before the Germans surrendered in Europe. The war with Japan, however, was expected to drag on for at least another year. Truman insisted that Roosevelt's cabinet remain in place, but with one caveat. Truman would consult with what was now his cabinet, but it would be the president making the ultimate decision. When Secretary of War Henry Stimson told Truman of the atomic bomb, Truman knew he might have a way to end World War II in the Pacific. In August of 1945, Truman authorized the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. The strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain to this day the only use of nuclear weapons against an enemy country during wartime. With Truman in control and his cabinet and Joint Chiefs seemingly relegated to more advisory than authoritarian positions, in 1950, the President made the decision, without asking Congress, to authorize war against Korea. Truman felt that Congress mostly favored the war, so he decided formal authorization from Congress would not be necessary. The move harshly divided Congress, and later, Truman's political opposition named the Korean conflict as Mr. Truman's War. The Truman Doctrine, however, gained the support of both sides of the political aisle. The doctrine was a policy of communist containment that eventually led the United States into the Korean War. When it became clear that the Korean conflict could lead to a full-scale war with the Soviet Union, General Douglas MacArthur's strategy to attack Chinese bases supplying Korea with Red Chinese and Soviet weapons and warplanes clashed with Truman's wishes to avoid that kind of potentially catastrophic conflict. When Truman dismissed MacArthur, he sealed his political fate. His approval rate among the American people plummeted, Gallup polls reporting them at 22%. Though an unpopular decision, Truman stood by his decision to fire MacArthur, later telling a reporter,
"I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. That's the answer to that. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was, but that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to 3/4 of them would be in jail."
3 years before the start of the war in Korea, another part of Truman's Cold War strategy took shape. The National Security Act of 1947 was a measure taken to merge the Departments of War and the Navy into a single body, the National Military Establishment, later renamed the Department of Defense, officially creating the U.S. Air Force and establishing the Central Intelligence Agency, the nation's first peacetime intelligence organization. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, originally a creation of FDR during World War II, was also established in the Act, which named the position as Chief of Staff of the Army, Naval Operations, Air Force, and later the Commandant of the Marine Corps. An act to promote the national security by providing for a Secretary of Defense, for a national military establishment, for a Department of the Army, a Department of the Navy, a Department of the Air Force, and for the coordination of the activities of the national military establishment with other departments and agencies of the government concerned with the national security, July 26, 1947. As of this writing, United States President Barack Obama has withdrawn American troops from Iraq and has set into motion a plan for withdrawing most of them from Afghanistan as well. How will the office of United States President continue to evolve? And what new duties and responsibilities will the President of the future face? At war or at peace, the job of the President of the United States of America is a tough one, but it's not without its perks and amenities. The buildings, institutions, and staff members that are required for the President to carry out his duties are each integral parts of a machine that is the presidential administration. In our next episode, we will examine the people and the parts that make the business of being president a successful one. Join us once again in our continuing look at the presidents, from politics to power.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.